welcome to Let's Talk. So let's talk the miracle of the seventh-day ox. I do apologize for the delay in reading of this book. I have had a lot going on. No excuse really, but I am finally getting a chance to record this as well. And we're going to get through, we're starting on chapter 20. I don't know how far we're going to go, but the title will tell you when I get done with this. So I'm so excited to get back into this because we left off on a note where the preacher man was in the box and the warden was faced with some elite colonels that came in and doing an inspection on the prison and was basically just slapped into reality of not being an animal. So God brought the comforter to Nikolai, and let's see where this story continues with him being in the box for over 2 years. Oh my gosh, can you imagine that? Okay, let's get started. Chapter 20, Miracle of the Seventh-Day Ox, narrated by Stefanie Pettis. Chapter 20. The colonel abruptly turned back to the crate. "Open that box," he ordered, his voice livid with anger. "Open the box at once." Yuri came forward and opened the lock, and he held the latch. He lifted the lid and reached into the box to help Nikolai stand to his feet. It had only been 3 days since Nikolai had been put into the box, but by now his legs were already like rubber. He tried to stand without wavering, but he couldn't. The strength was not there. With so few days between the stints in the box, he had slowly lost the ability to recuperate quickly, and each time his legs would atrophy a little more. "Here, lay him in this pile of straw over here," the colonel barked, "and get him a drink of water." He waved his hand to ward off the flies and the stench that was permeating the shed. "And bring a bucket of water so he can clean himself up." The colonel looked to Nikolai and shook his head again. "What is your name, young man?" "Panchuk, sir. Nikolai Panchuk." The officer looked kindly at Nikolai. "Is it true that you won't work?" "No, it is not true." Nikolai swallowed some of the water from the cup Yuri had handed him. "I will work. I'll work harder than any other person if need be. I'll get up early and stay up late every night, but I cannot dishonor God and work on His holy Sabbath day." The colonel raised his eyebrows. "The seventh day of every week is God's Sabbath?" Nikolai continued, seeing the opportunity to witness once again about his beloved Sabbath. "I was raised to keep it holy, and I cannot violate my conscience, sir. On the seventh day of each week, I can't work because this would be disobeying the commands of my God." Nikolai wanted to be respectful of the officer, but right now he was lying in a pile of straw. It was hard to stand at attention or salute the colonel while lying prostrate on the stable floor. The nervousness showed on his face. "At ease, prisoner," came the colonel's reassuring command, and as he stared down Nikolai. "What did you do for a living before you came to this camp?" "I was a pastor, sir. It is why I was sent here in the first place, because I wouldn't turn over a list of my church members to the KGB. Nikolai's voice wavered and then almost broke with emotion as he added, I could not, sir. It would have betrayed the confidence of my members that they had placed in me and as their spiritual leader." Nikolai felt strange. Why was he bearing his soul to this unknown army officer? He felt chagrined and relieved at the same time. He couldn't explain it, but somehow it seemed the right thing to do at this point. "So you will work, but you won't work on Saturdays, your sabota, as you call it." "Yes, sir. I will work hard before sunup and well after dark to make up for the time I miss on Saturdays." The colonel looked up at the warden. Do you have a job like this? One that can be done on some days and not others? A job that can be done in fewer days if this man works more hours each of the other days? The warden thought long for a moment. Well, there is water that is needed to be brought from the spring a kilometer away. He glanced at the colonel. We need barrels of water, and it usually takes a man and ox 7 days of hauling to bring enough water for the camp. Enough for drinking water, cooking, and washing the men need to do. The warden looked at Nikolai lying in the straw and then at the colonel. I suppose we could give it a try. The man doing it now works from dawn to dusk and barely has time enough to bring in 9 to 10 barrels of water we need on average per day. If Panchuk wants to get up and work before dawn each day and then work after dark, maybe he can manage to bring enough by Friday night. I doubt it, but we can give it a try. The warden had a cynical look in his eyes, but he chose his word carefully in front of the colonel. The officer brightened. All right then, Panchuk. It's a deal. Let's see what you can do. Tomorrow's Tuesday. The warden says that if you can bring enough water by Friday night, you can have your day off. 5 days of work in 4. If you can do it, then Saturday is a free day. And then the colonel got a serious look in his eyes as he looked straight at Nikolai. But if you can't keep up your end of the bargain, you're going to have to haul water on Saturdays too. Your sabota, as you call it. Are we clear on this? Absolutely. I'm curious, Panchuk. The colonel searched Nikolai's face, although it was filled with pain. It held a piece of heaven. You have been so stubborn in refusing to work on your sabota, he continued. What happens if Saturdays come and you still don't have enough water? We got a deal, and yet somehow I get the feeling you would probably still choose to go into the box, then work and violate your holy day. Nikolai thought about the question before answering, the kindest Russian military officer he had ever met. He chose his words carefully because he wanted to honor the colonel's faith in him and the warden's willingness to give him a chance to prove himself. If I honor my God, he will honor me, sir. He knows I wish to worship him in prayer, quiet meditation on that day. So I'm placing my confidence in him that he will give me the strength to complete the challenge. I will work half the night, if need be, just to complete my part of the bargain and secure for myself the right to worship my God on that day. You know, I believe you will. The colonel nodded and smiled kindly. The man's generosity made Nikolai feel warm inside, and it gave him hope that everything would turn out for the best after all. It seemed that this was the break he had been hoping for, the chance he had been waiting and wanting for 2 years. A chance to show everyone the sovereignty of his God. Nikolai rested the remainder of the day, trying to limber up his knees to work again. By nightfall, he felt pretty good. However, as he lay in his bunk the night in his barracks, he thought about the distance of the spring. It had to be more than a half a mile, 1 kilometer. That would be almost a mile and a half, 2.5 kilometers each round trip. Nikolai figured it would take maybe 2.5 to 3 hours each load of water. From what he had seen, the ox cart carried 2 barrels at a time, so that meant he needed to haul 5 loads a day to bring the quota of water per day. But he needed to haul enough water for Saturday's supply too. There was no question about it. Nikolai knew he was going to have to haul at least 1 or 2 extra loads a day to make it. With his mind whirling, he took some time to pray before dozing off. Lord, help me not to worry. Help me to have the energy I need to take on this amazing challenge. It is truly a challenge straight from the courts of heaven. Chapter 21. Before dawn had even lit the eastern sky the next morning, Nikolai was out at the stables helping Oleg, the ox cart driver, hitch up old Maskim. Oleg would be working with Nikolai for the day to teach him the routine of hauling water from the spring. Nikolai knew that this was his chance to win the Sabbath privileges and be a powerful witness for God. For 2 years, he had been confined repeatedly in a wooden box for 10 days at a time because he wouldn't work on the Sabbath. But he remained true to his convictions and suffered everything the warden could throw at him. Now, God had provided Nikolai a way of escape from the torture box with his faith intact. It was time for Nikolai to witness in a different sort of way. There was so much at stake. Would God help Nikolai do what seemed to be an impossibility? Could Nikolai and Maskim haul 7 days worth of water in just 6 days of time each week? And at this week the task was even more daunting, 5 days worth of water in 4? In Nikolai's mind, it would take a miracle, but that was, of course, what God was all about. It was about Nikolai's busy life as a pastor had been all about. It was what his interrogation episodes with the KGB had been all about. His eventual sentence at the prison camp and his confinement in the box for refusing to work on the Sabbath day. And it was what his release and new assignment with Maxim were all about. Nikolai's life of sacrifice and service to God had been one miracle after another. And Nikolai doubted the miracles would stop now. There was too much at stake. And so it was that Nikolai and Oleg set out for the spring across the treeless steeps. It took them more than an hour to make the trek, and they walked along laboriously behind the plodding ox. "Can't we make this old ox hurry any faster?" Nikolai complained as the ox cart humbered slowly along the past muskigs around the bogs. "If he walks slow all day, we'll never get our 5 loads in by the end of the day." "Oh, we'll get the water in, all right, but old Maxim had never promised me that we'd do it before dark. Often we come trudging in long after dark. You should know that. You were in there when the shed and you witnessed lots of times." Nikolai stared at Oleg, stunned, looking settling in on his face. If they couldn't manage regular number of loads in a given day, how were they going to be able to get extra barrels of water hauled to camp? Oleg just shook his head. "I guess you thought this was going to be an easy job," he snorted. No, not actually, but I was hoping we would be able to get Maxim to move along a little faster." Oleg made a face and shook his head again. "Look, I'm sorry that you had to stay cooped up in that box, and I'm glad the colonel let you out. But this business of getting more barrels of water so you can have your day off is crazy. Old Maxim here knows nothing about that. All he knows is that when he wants to walk, he walks, and when he wants to walk slower, there's nothing you can do to hurry him up." Nikolai wanted to say something, but he didn't. "I know what you're thinking," Oleg kept on. "You were thinking that since you're a preacher man, your God would work some kind of miracle. Am I right? Aren't I?" Oleg gave the ox a slap on his rump. "You thought your God would reach down out of the sky above and tickle old Maxim's ear or something to make him move faster, didn't you? And then Maxim would run like nobody's business and have all the water for the weeks hauled to the camp in 6 days. Hey, maybe even in 5. Oleg was still shaking his head. His reaction seemed logical enough. Should Nikolai have expected anything less? He had thought that the other prisoners might admire him for standing up for what he believed in, but maybe that wasn't the case at all. Maybe they had no respect for the man who wouldn't work, especially if he was asking for 1 day off of work in 7. All of the men working hard, and they were being held at the prison camp against their will. Then, too, like the warden, they didn't know a thing about Nikolai's God or the devotion he had for his Maker. Nikolai had nothing more to say, so he walked the remainder of the distance in silence. What was the use? The first rays of sunshine were just beginning to peek over the horizon when they arrived at the spring. Nikolai helped Oleg dip wooden buckets into the pool of water at the spring and pour them into the barrels waiting on the ox cart. It wasn't a hard task, but several times Nikolai sloshed water from the buckets on himself. The morning air was still chilly, and the cold water made Nikolai shiver. He realized that if he wanted to stay dry, he was going to have to learn how to put more water in the barrels in less on himself. Besides, if he were careless, it would take that much longer to fill the barrels. Oleg put the wooden lids on the 2 barrels and then nudged Maxim forward with his ox goad. Nikolai was glad to see that Oleg no longer used the leather prod to beat Maxim. He used the goad instead to guide the ox and send him signals as to what he wanted him to do. The trip back to camp, even though longer since the cart was loaded down with full barrels of water, several times Nikolai tried to urge Maxim along faster, but always the old ox resisted his efforts. In fact, any attempts to hurry him along seemed to make him move slower. If Nikolai could have gotten into the harness to help Maxim pull the cart along faster, he thought he would gladly do it. As it was, he and Oleg were at the mercy of Maxim and his whims to move along in his own pace. In the end, Nikolai realized Oleg was right. There was nothing they could do but walk along patiently beside the cart. Chapter 22. At the camp, they worked to unload the barrels from the cart, trying to avoid spilling any of the precious water. It was a simple routine, but Nikolai wanted to get on the road again. Unfortunately, as they began the process all over again, neither Maxim or Oleg seemed to be in a hurry to move at a pace that suited Nikolai. But now Nikolai was beginning to feel he would rather work by himself than Oleg along. In fact, he was sure of it. As the 2 of them filled the barrels for the second time and then turned old Maxim around for a trip back to camp, Nikolai began to form a plan. Why tie up the 2 of the men doing the same job? Why tie up time of 2 men doing a job? That could be done by 1. The job was turning into to be much easier than Nikolai had anticipated. Old Maxim was doing most of the work anyway. Nikolai waited to speak his mind until after they unloaded the 2 barrels of water at the kitchen. "I've been thinking," Nikolai ventured. "It's a long way out to the spring, and it seems a terrible waste of manpower to have both of us walking all the way out there. You've taught me what I need to know, and now the rest is up to Maxim. Would you let me try to run by myself? If I have any trouble, I can let you know when I get back." Nikolai wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve and ran his hand through his hair. "Do you think that would work?" You're probably right," Oleg admitted as he stared at the empty water barrels that they had just loaded onto the cart. He stole a glance at Nikolai. "You probably have no trouble." And so Nikolai began his new job solo, and he put his energy into it. As soon as he was out of earshot, he began to do his best to get Maxim to increase his speed. But old Maxim didn't appreciate being hurried along. A few times Nikolai tried whipping him a bit, but with the goad, but after a few hundred meters of this, old Maxim slowed his pace down almost to a standstill. In the end, Nikolai realized once again the truth of what Oleg had said. Old Maxim just couldn't be made to run faster. He would walk when he wanted to. He would stop when he wanted to. And short of beating the ox mercilessly, it wasn't going to change anything. They made more trips out to the spring, but as the day wound down, so did Maxim's energy. Near the end, he was walking slower and slower. Now Nikolai was really frustrated, and if the whole thing hadn't been so pathetic, he might have laughed. To Nikolai, it was obvious that Maxim didn't care how many loads he could get in before dark. He was just an animal. But, animal or not, in some ways it appeared that Maxim was just another one of the prisoners. He was being forced to work against his will, harnessed to a cart every morning, and made to walk back and forth all day to the spring. That was the life of a prisoner in prison camp, wasn't it? Work, work, work. Like machines, Nikolai and Maxim would spend each day working as though that was what they had been made to do. They might not like it, but they would do it anyway, because that was what everyone did out here on the windswept steppes of Siberia. But all of that was just rhetoric. At the end of each day, Nikolai needed to have more than his quota of 5 cartloads of water in the camp. By the end of the week, he needed 10 extra barrels of water, or he was going to go through more pain and alienation in the box. This was his one chance. This was the opportunity Nikolai had been longing for during the 2 years he had been cooped up in a wooden crate. So whether Maxim felt like moving fast or not, they needed to get the extra water in by Friday evening. If they had to haul a water half the night, they were going to have to do it. Nikolai was going to prove to the warden that working hard and having a Sabbath day's rest was possible. He wanted Yuri to know it, and Oleg, and any other person in the camp who witnessed the persistent loyalty to the Sabbath and his God. But by the time the shadows were longing on the Siberian landscape, Nikolai knew it wasn't enough. He was going to have to work after dark. The sun was low in the sky, and the 5th cartload rumbled into camp, and he knew that he needed at least one more load tonight if he was going to make a dent in the 10 extra barrels he needed by Friday night. When Nikolai had finished unloading the barrels, he turned the cart around quickly and headed out of the camp for one more spring. But Maxim had other ideas. He pulled the cart off the road and towards the stables, just 40 or 50 meters away. Not to be outdone, Nikolai pulled hard to the left to steer Maxim back onto the road. It was a battle of man against beast, brain against brute. Maxim wasn't used to going back to the spring at this time of night, but Nikolai knew that he had to have an extra load of water. Nikolai used the goad to persuade Maxim. "Can't you get into your thick skull that I'm doing this for your own good?" Nikolai half shouted, I'm just as tired as you are, he added to the stubborn resolution that surprised himself. But if it doesn't matter, we're going to do this whether you like it or not. Nikolai felt bad yelling at Maxim like that. The old ox was tired. He had worked all day pulling the cart back and forth from the spring. They had already hauled 5 loads of water and walked what Nikolai figured was more than 7 miles, 12 kilometers. And now they were going to walk another 1.5 miles, 2 and 3 kilometers, and put in another 2 or 3 hours of work. He wished he could somehow convey the idea to Maxim that a day of rest for the man on Sabbath would be a day of rest for the ox, but he guessed that he would have to leave that job up to God. The Creator truly knew how to do that. Chapter 23. The next morning, Nikolai was up before everyone. He was up before any of the other prisoners had stirred, and before the warden or guards. He was up even before the cook had begun to stoke the fires in the kitchen. But the sun was already peeking up over the horizon, and Nikolai guessed it must be about 4 a.m. He was a little weary of the short night. His legs were a bit stiff, but he flexed them again and again to limber them up. He couldn't afford to sleep or slack off now. He needed to be up and going and out on the road off to the spring so he could get enough water barrels hauled by Friday. The sun wasn't up yet. It hadn't even begun to rise in the east as Nikolai threw on his clothes, grabbed a flask of water, and went to the stables to rouse old Maxim. Of course, the hour was earlier than Maxim was accustomed to, but Nikolai managed to get him on his feet and into a harness. The old ox eyed Nikolai warily, as if he were suspicious of the man's every move. And why shouldn't he be? This man was crazy, urging him to hurry all day long, pushing him to work all hours of the night, and now was getting the ox up and out of the stable at an earlier hour. Nikolai was in a hurry to get going. He didn't think he had time to eat a regular breakfast, but he did stop by the kitchen for a carry-out meal. The cook was up by now and gave him some bread and carrots to take with him. Nikolai knew he could stop by the kitchen later that morning for some hot broche and Russian bread. But for now, the cold food would have to do. The man and the ox headed west out of the camp and toward the spring. Maxim knew the way even in the dark. He could walk the distance himself without anyone guiding him. He would have even been able to make a trip with Nikolai sleeping in the back of the ox cart. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough room in the cart. The barrels were too big and took up all the space. The morning was peaceful at this hour. With the silence of nature all around them, the only sound that broke the stillness of the morning was the creaking of old Maxim's harness and the squeaking wheels of the cart. Other than that, there was little to no punctuate to the early morning hour. In the pale light of pre-dawn, Nikolai could see a few lemons come out of the burrows they had made for themselves in the matted sedge lining the roadway. A little farther along, he saw a snowy owl perched on a craggy rock poking its way through the Siberian landscape. And of course, there were the snow hares, now brown with their summer camouflage. At one point, Nikolai rounded a bend in the road and suddenly caught his breath. Sitting in the middle of the road was a large wolf, his lanky body tall and lean. Nikolai guessed he was about 3 foot tall at the shoulder, and just sat there staring at the man and the ox. Maxim pulled to a stop for a few minutes. It was obvious the ox didn't really know what to do. Nikolai sensed he was frightened because he could see the muscles rip and tighten in the ox's necks and shoulder. Did Nikolai need to worry? Was this wolf out scouting for a meal? Would he come back with others from his wolf pack? The wolf finally got up and trotted off to the north. Nikolai breathed a little easier after the wolf left. No one had alerted him to the possibilities of wolf attacks out here. He and Oleg hadn't encountered the wolf the previous day. He consoled himself with the idea that the wolf was probably not a threat to them anyway. There were plenty of lemmings and snowshoe hares for the wolf to hunt and eat. Of course, when the harsh winter struck Siberia come October, Nikolai was not sure of where he and the ox would rank in the food chain for a hungry pack of wolves. Food was not exactly abundant in the deserted country. The only other stable game of the steppes of the Siberia would be the reindeer that traveled in scattered herds, or so he had been told when he asked Petya, the cook, during the conversation with him in the kitchen one evening. Chapter 24. It had been one of those days, months back, when Nikolai had just gotten out of the box and was trying to recuperate. He had managed to hobble to the kitchen late in the day to get something to eat. After the evening meal, he had stayed late to help Petya scrub the pots and pans and prepare some sourdough for baking the next morning. They worked in silence until Petya began talking about cooking and the limited supply of ingredients he had in the camp. He was hoping for some reindeer meat that winter. The reindeer herds come this way some years never see them, Petya had said as he covered the sourdough with a towel and set it aside. When they do come, we can shoot a few. We lay aside enough meat for a good while. 15 or 20 reindeer is a lot of meat, but of course it doesn't go far with 300 men in camp. Petya glanced up at Nikolai and raised his eyebrows. I suppose you were wondering where the guns were they used to hunt reindeer. Well, I hadn't thought about that, but now that you mentioned it, I haven't seen any guns in camp. That's because they don't bring the guns out unless the reindeer herds come this way. I think they must keep the rifles locked up in the warden's office or something. No one really knows. But I've never been told, he continued. Of course they give the rifles only to the guards, but no one really gives it much thought. Everyone is just glad to get some meat to eat. Reindeer is pretty good eating. Petya began to hang the pots and pans up to dry, and Nikolai did what he could to help. If the reindeer don't come this way, then we have to satisfy ourselves with the cabbage, turnips, beets, and onions we grow in the gardens. They keep pretty well, and in the cold winter we can store them underground in the beds of hay. Nikolai thought about the vegetables that Petya cooked up in the brosh, cabbage and beets mostly. Brosh was something every Russian ate every day. Not to have brosh for a man's meal was considered almost unthinkable. Petya had big forearms for his work in the kitchen, making bread, cutting up turnips and beets, and scrubbing pots and pans could do that to you. He was a quiet man and didn't appear to have many friends, but he was a great cook. Everybody said so. You're a good cook, Petya, Nikolai found himself saying, especially with the limited resources you have to work with. You just say that because you don't know any better, Petya insisted, laughing good-naturedly, and Nikolai found himself laughing too. You've been locked up in a box too long. You're always hungry, and anything that hits your tongue tastes good to you, Petya added. Nikolai reminiscing ended when he reached the spring, and he filled his water barrels, and the sun finally rose in all its glory. He worked quickly to finish the job, and then turned to Maxim and the ox cart around. It felt like they were making progress, and Maxim was responding well to the urgency Nikolai felt. At this pace, Nikolai was sure we would be able to bring home 6 loads of water, 12 barrels. And who knew? Maybe they would be enough. Maybe they would be able to do enough more than that. If Nikolai mined 7 trips to the spring was not out of the question. All that morning, Nikolai drove the ox hard, never letting up with a stick, never allowing the ox to rest or pause by the road. And for a little sedge grass, today was Wednesday. If he could manage to get 14 barrels of water into the camp by bedtime and another 14 on Thursday, he would have to only get 10 on Friday. That would give him time to get home, prepare properly for the Sabbath when it was time for the sun to set. But Nikolai was getting way ahead of himself, and he had misjudged the nature of the beast of burden. As morning turned to afternoon and the sun turned west, old Maxim began to slow his pace. His shoulders sagged a little more. His tongue began to hang out when they stopped at the spring or at the camp and unload the full barrels. Of course, Nikolai let the ox have a good long drink while he was filling the barrels at the spring. This was efficiency at its best. Why not give Maxim a chance to get rest and drink and fill while Nikolai was busy filling the water barrels? But when they were back at camp, Nikolai paused only long enough for Petya to hand him some bread and a tin bowl full of red broche. At these times, Nikolai never gave Maxim a chance to get more than a short drink. And so they plodded along, with Maxim growing more tired each hour, slower with each leg of each trip. By late afternoon, it was obvious they were pushing Maxim hard and sapped the ox's stamina and his willingness to keep going. In fact, the 5th trip of the spring took more than 3 hours. The sun was low in the sky now, and Nikolai could see they were going to be hard-pressed to get 6 loads of water. They were going to have to work long after night again to do it. He was so frustrated with Maxim as the time slipped away, but what could he do? He determined that he would simply have to drive the ox harder. He had no other choice. This would have to go faster to get the water in by the Sabbath. Nikolai had come too far in his plan to let it go now. With a stronger resolve, Nikolai vowed to make Maxim work if it was the last thing he did on earth. But Nikolai knew that if this was going to really happen, something was going to have to change. He was going to have to reshape the way Maxim did things, to modify an animal's behavior. You had to force him to obey, either by punishing him for wrong behavior or by rewarding him with obedience. He cringed and suddenly realized that this is exactly what the warden had been trying to do with him. The warden had been stubbornly putting him in the wooden crate, trying to break him. "If that is what I was doing to you?" Nikolai asked incredulously as he stared at Maxim. "Is that what this is all about?" The Lehmans along the roadside stopped their squeaking and sat up to hear more of the debate. The snowshoe hares browsing on the short sedge grass perked up their ears to hear the final verdict. For a long moment, Nikolai gave the idea some thought. But then, just as suddenly as he snapped out of his reverie, "There's no time to wait now," he argued in his mind, seesawing back in the other direction. "I don't have time to be feeling sorry for an ox that doesn't want to work hard. If I can do it, then he can do it too." Nikolai didn't let up. "I'll push you all day, Maxim, and all night if I need to. I'll go without meals. I'll go without sleep." In frustration, he whacked Maxim on the rump with his goad, and the ox jumped forward. Maxim was going to work hard all day. Nikolai would see to that. Of course, at the end of the week, Maxim was going to get the Sabbath off just as Nikolai was. The pastor smiled. In spite of his irritation, any rest for Nikolai would be rest for Maxim. The old ox didn't know it yet, but he would soon enough. Come Sabbath, he would be lying in a stable, enjoying the sedge-grass piled high in his trough. Chapter 25. On Thursday morning, Nikolai was up even earlier the day before. But his worst fears from the day before had been realized. Try as he might, he had managed to haul only 6 loads of water. As he thought about how hard he had worked until long after dark, the whole thing was disheartening. What else did he need to do that he had not already done? Short of giving up, there seemed no answers. When Nikolai went to the stables, Maxim seemed listless and tired, as though he had already used up the day's ration of energy. As they headed out of camp, the old ox walked with his head down and no light in his eyes. He didn't even look Nikolai's way when the man tried to give him his favorite snack, a carrot. Nikolai knew he was now paying the price for pushing Maxim to the limit 2 days in a row, and in some sad sort of way it seemed only right. He had ignored the common sense logic and the goodness of his heart that he should have been kinder to the animal. Justice in nature, law of averages had prevailed, and Nikolai couldn't deny that it should be so. Hour after hour, the ox plodded slowly along with no sense of the urgency Nikolai felt. He had worked overtime 2 days in a row, and now it seemed that he was thinking he deserved to slow things down a bit. After all, it wasn't his neck on the line. Why should he work faster simply to trade one day for another? Of course, he had no knowledge of Nikolai's Sabbath or the importance of the standoff between the preacher and the warden. The sun passed its zenith as morning turned to afternoon. White cumulus clouds scudded across the landscape now, green with the short grasses of summer growth. A few white cardamom flowers stared up at the man and the ox as they passed by with the creaking water cart. Suddenly, the lone wolf came out to watch them again. This time he sat on a slight rise to the south, following their every move as though the man and beast were the beast's source of entertainment he had seen in days. But Nikolai hardly noticed them. He was growing more and more discouraged by the hour. All his efforts to work hard and deliver the quota of barrels by sunset Friday were going to be of no avail. It just wasn't going to be enough. Nikolai could feel it in his bones. There wasn't enough time. Nikolai filled the water barrels for the 3rd time that day, and then turned the cart around again as he trudged along the road. Nikolai did the math one more time. 10 barrels of water per day were needed, 50 by Friday night, so that he wouldn't have to haul any on the Sabbath. 2 barrels of water per trip meant he needed to make 25 trips in 4 days. With the 6 loads he hauled on Tuesday and the 6th on Wednesday, he would need a total of 13 more. That meant he would need 7 at least for today, then maybe 6 on Friday. How was he going to be able to do it? How hadn't he managed to bring in 7 loads either of the other 2 days? And today Maxim was working even slower. 7 loads seemed impossible. To be sure, at this rate, they'd never make it by sundown Friday. If he had begun working on Sunday, maybe he would have been able to bring in 1 extra trip per day. Maybe then he had gotten the number of barrels needed by Friday night. But now, old Maxim was even limping a bit, and his pace had slowed down a little more than a crawl. Nikolai finally stopped the old ox and examined his foot. The foot had picked up a rock, so Nikolai removed it. He stood up and sighed before slapping Maxim on the hindquarters. There was no longer any point in using the ox goad to urge Maxim along. He simply let the ox go at his own pace. Evening finally came, putting both Nikolai and Maxim out of their misery. They had managed only 5 loads from the spring, 10 barrels of water. That was a good day's work, but not nearly enough to move them closer to Nikolai's goal. Nikolai's confidence was waning. He had thought a Sabbath day's rest would be a sure thing. Didn't God want him to have his Sabbath off? So what had gone wrong? Why hadn't things worked out between him and old Maxim? Why hadn't God helped him with the number of loads that he needed to fill his quota by Friday night? Did God have other plans? Did God want him to spend another 10 days in the box? Had it been his original plan for Nikolai all along? Nikolai's brow knit in a furrow frown. It didn't matter. He knew he wouldn't work on the Sabbath, even with the ultimatum from the warden hanging over his head. There just seemed no way out, no way to turn.